Hello, I'm Vanja Gröger, also known as Nechtan, and this is going to be a drum-focused album review of this beautiful album here, Dusk and Her Embrace from Cradle of Filth. Enjoy! It has been a while since I did a review like this, and now after this time I felt the need to do one more. Well, Cradle of Filth, I think I do not need to introduce this band to you, because, well, it is one of the most well-known bands out there, especially in the more extreme subgenres of metal, and it has had quite an impact on the scene, especially in black metal. So if you do not know Cradle of Filth, then you need to check them out. So, Dusk and Her Embrace. This was Cradle of Filth's third studio album, and it was released in 1996. There is some confusion about if this is actually their second album and not their third, but I will come to that later. First of all, let me say that this album was a big breakthrough for Cradle of Filth, and with this album they became really widely known. Regarding the confusion about the order of releases around this time, well, with Dusk and Her Embrace it is a little bit difficult. As far as I know, this album was recorded for the first time in 1995. And during this time, Cradle of Filth was fighting a legal battle with their label because they had some problems, and yeah, so in the end this album was not released. Still, they were bound by contract to release a second album on this label after the first one, which was The Principle of Evil Made Flesh. So instead of Dusk and Her Embrace, they wrote a new album and also scrapped some older songs and put them in this album and whatnot, and this became Vampire. So the Vampire album was, well, it was rushed a lot because it was for them just a way to get away from their old label, and later in interviews they admitted that they didn't put in their best effort and this wasn't really their favorite album. But still, it turned out better than expected, and even today, some of the songs from the Vampire album still are played live. So, but now let us come to Dusk and Her Embrace. After the legal battle with their old label was over, they won the rights to re-record Dusk and Her Embrace. So, Dusk and Her Embrace was written before the Vampire album and also recorded the first time before the Vampire album. Then came the Vampire album, and then Dusk and Her Embrace was re-recorded, and just then it was also released in 1996. So this is kind of where this confusion comes from. And in 2016, the old version of the album from 1995 was re-released as Dusk and Her Embrace, the Original Sin. But I'm not talking about that album, but I'm talking about the re-recorded version from 1996, just to avoid confusion. So, after all that being said, let us start finally talking about the album itself. And as in my previous reviews, I will start with the exterior, with the visuals of the album. So, this is the cover. As you can see, there are some autographs on this cover from Cradle of Filth, so you cannot make out every detail on the cover of this copy. And well, to be honest, this copy of the album is actually not my copy of the album, but is from my very good friend Ivan Chertov from Craving. Thank you, Ivan. Not only the cover, but the whole album artwork is kept in grey. Well, at least for my eyes it looks grey with maybe a little hint of green in it. And well, I think the artwork on this album is quite special. Because, well, the cover itself looks pretty nice, but as soon as you turn the CD, you're immediately struck with this image of a young woman covered in blood and in a very strange costume. Well, when you open the CD case, the CD itself, it is bright red. And this was actually quite confusing for me in the beginning, because when I first bought this album, I actually thought in the first moments that there was maybe the wrong CD in this album. Well, what is also a little bit confusing about the CD itself is that you cannot find the album name anywhere on it. So this just added to my confusion if this was actually the correct CD. So let us start taking a closer look at the booklet. On the first page there's the list of songs, and on the second page the lyrics begin. I will say more to the lyrics later, but for now you can already see that the lyrics are pretty long and that each song has quite some words in it. Here we can see some band pictures, and I think it's very funny how it's actually not said which member of the band plays which instrument. Well, one example of that would be Danny. It says here, Danny desires better unsung. In every other booklet it would say Danny vocals, but not with Cradle of Filth. They kind of have the habit of, they have the habit to invent very creative phrases to describe what they are doing. Well, some more examples would be Robin Nocturnal Pulse, which is probably the bass, or Stuart Requiems of War and Woe, instead of guitars. On the next two pages, again, lyrics, and in the middle of the booklet is a big picture of the same woman, which is also on the cover. The booklet continues with even more lyrics. And finally, here we have a very special band picture of Cradle of Filth. Well, I think they really put in a lot of effort to reflect the mood and the atmosphere of the music in their booklet. And the outcome is quite an exquisite and explicit artwork, as you can see. Some more pictures here, and here you can also see Nicholas Barker, and of course it doesn't say Nick Barker drums, but it just says Nicholas Hammer of the Gods. And on the last pages we have some credits and thank yous and stuff like that, and it is written so incredibly small that it's very hard to read. Well, I won't go over all the thanks and credits, but there are some interesting observations to be made. And well, the most interesting thing about this is that even the thanks kind of keep the atmosphere and the mood of the rest of the album. The whole album is kept in a very, how can I say it, maybe it is very dark and poetic. And even the credits reflect that. So everything is worded kind of in the same spirit as the whole album. For example, I mean, in any normal booklet, people would thank something like, oh yeah, thanks to my friends and family and everyone who supported us. But well, not with Cradle of Filth. For example, Danny likes to thank kindred spirits, lost souls, and bloodlined loved ones, and so on. Yeah, Nick Barker also contributes a little poem and stuff like that. So everything is kept in this very poetic, dark mood, and I really like that. So let's start with actually talking about the music itself on this album, and we will start with the sound and production. It is very interesting to compare the production of this album to the previous album, Vampire, because normally when you just listen to both albums and don't know when they were released, I think most people would think that Vampire was actually the newer album and Dusk was the older album, but it is not so. Vampire has a very, very clean production and sounds, well, maybe a little bit too clean sometimes, and has a very sharp sound to it. Dusk and Her Embrace, on the other side, sounds very organic and very warm. When I say organic, I don't mean organic in a sense of bad production or lo-fi production, because it is not. Dusk and Her Embrace sounds still very clear, but at the same time kind of manages to sound organic and warm. And I think the sound of the drums plays a large part in that. One more aspect which makes this album sound clear and organic is the fact that the guitars don't sound very bass heavy and not very brutal, but instead they leave a lot of room for the bass player actually. So you can make out the bass very well on this album, and it plays a far more important role than on many other metal albums. So let's talk about the sound of the drums on this album. I'm not sure about that, but I think there's the possibility that they didn't use any triggers at all. The sound of the bass drum, for example, sounds very natural to me, and you can clearly hear the bass drum in all the mid-tempo or slower parts, but in the fast parts you have to listen very closely to make out the individual hits. And this is a strong indication for not having triggered the bass drum. Maybe they did mix the trigger with a acoustic signal, I don't know, but at least it sounds very natural to me. The toms on this album also sound quite natural, and I'm pretty sure they had a drum kit with very big toms. And yeah, with the way Nick Barker plays his fills, it sounds awesome. The cymbals on this album are very loud compared to other metal albums. And well, I have to admit I really like that, because on many metal albums, especially many modern metal albums, the cymbals are so low in the mix that sometimes during blast beats, for example, you have a hard time making out the hi-hat or the right cymbal, and I really hate that, because the cymbals are very essential in drumming as far as my taste goes. So I really like that the cymbals are very clear on this album. The sound of the snare is sometimes a little bit difficult for the listener, because it has, I think it has a lot of attack and is quite sharp, so to say. And it is also a little bit too loud for my taste compared to the bass drum. And when Nicholas Barker plays blast beats, where the snare is played on the offbeat, it is sometimes very difficult as a listener to follow the beat and stay on the beat, because, well, you cannot hear the bass drum loud enough to have a good counterpart to the snare. Well, overall the sound is quite clear and still organic and warm, and although I do not like some of the details, like for example the snare, which is a little bit too loud maybe, I really like the overall sound of the album. So that's it regarding the sound. Let us now talk about the most interesting part for most of my viewers, which is the drumming. First of all, if you haven't noticed until now, the drummer on this album is Nicholas Barker, who is, by the way, my favorite drummer. I already talked about him on several of my videos, including one review of a Dimmu Borgir album, but I can just say again that on this album you can really hear how good he actually is and what makes him an outstanding drummer. Of course, there are always faster drummers out there, or drummers who are better at blast beats or better at double bass or whatever. But Nicholas Barker is very creative, and his fills are just mind-blowing. On this album, he not only shows off his fast fills and his fast blast beat skills, but also, and especially in the slow parts, I think he does a great job at playing the drums in a way that fits perfectly to the songs. And especially in these very slow parts, you can hear, for example, that his bass drum follows exactly what the bass player does in some parts. And it is great to actually hear that on an album, because on many metal albums you cannot hear the bass at all, or just very low in the mix. But on this album, especially in the more calm parts, it is clearly audible. Also, he plays many little details here and there that make the more calm parts still sound very interesting. He plays little accents on the toms or the bass drum or cymbal chokes and, well, stuff like that. And, well, The one thing that he's really famous for, his fast fill-ins, well, he really shows them off on this album. There's one track in particular where he really kind of almost plays, well, I think you can actually call it a drum solo. And I really laughed it when I heard this the first time, and I still laugh it now after having heard it like 100 times. I really recommend you to listen to that particular part, and it is actually the end of the title track on this album, Dusk and Her Embrace. There you can find his awesome drum solo and some really fast blast beats. Enjoy! What's also very interesting about Nick Barker's drumming on this album is his blast beats, for example. I think he may not have kind of developed his full blast beat potential on this album yet, because later in Dimmu you can hear him playing a lot of fast blast beats with a snare on the offbeat, traditional blast beats. But on this album, well, he also plays extremely fast on this album, but most of his blast beats are played with the bass drum and the snare at the same time. He still plays the traditional blast beat on this album, but much slower than his other blast beats. And I think it's really interesting to see a drummer like him in an earlier stage of development maybe. But still, even if he was in a kind of earlier stage of development at that point, it's even more impressive how precise he plays everything. I'm pretty sure there's no quantization going on this album, but everything sounds super tight, and especially his fills are played with, it's not just the precision, but also the power with which he hits the toms. And it just sounds super brutal. Well, I have talked a lot about the drums on this album, and I mean, this is the main focus of this review, but I cannot end this review without talking about the vocals. The vocalist of Cradle of Filth is Danny Filth, and his vocals are extremely unique, and well, I think either people hate him for that or people love him for that. I personally really love his vocals. And particularly on this album, he really shows an extremely impressive range of different vocal styles that he utilizes. He uses kind of more mid-range normal shouts, also deep growling, and also his signature very high-pitched screams. And I think this is what many people do not like about his vocals, his very high screams. But honestly, on this album, with this kind of music, it perfectly fits the atmosphere. In my opinion, Danny Filth is not just a great vocalist, but also the greatest poet in metal music. Of course, he writes all the lyrics himself, and when you take a closer look at the lyrics, you will realize just how well written they are. For me, as a non-native speaker, it is very hard to actually understand his lyrics because all the plays with words that he does and all the exotic choices of words that he makes. And well, many of the words that he uses just don't appear on a standard vocabulary list when you learn English. Apart from that, he uses a lot of references to, for example, Greek mythology, but also to works from Lovecraft or Edgar Allan Poe, or the Bible even. So you need to have some sort of background knowledge for all these topics to be able to understand what he says. So if you own a Cradle of Filth album, I can just recommend to read through the lyrics while you listen to the music, and to also have a dictionary by your side. So all in all, this album is really a great album, and it really deserves that many people think about it as maybe the most influential or the best Cradle of Filth album. For me personally, I'm not sure if Dusk and Her Embrace is my favorite album, but that's not because it is a bad album or something, because it is not. It is a great album. But Cradle of Filth have put out a lot of albums that are very great in my opinion, and that are so different from each other that it's really hard to compare. One other favorite album of mine would be, for example, Median, And when you compare Medium to Dusk and Her Embrace, it is just not possible because the albums are so just different. The whole atmosphere is different, the production is different, and yeah, it just cannot be compared. But Dusk and Her Embrace is really one of the top albums from Cradle of Filth, there's no doubt in that. Last but not least, I would like to mention that I really love this album, not just because it is a great album, but also because I listened to it a lot during a time where I was developing as a person. I did some crazy things back then, like going on a walk in the middle of the night in a graveyard. And during these times, I often had my portable CD player with me, and I was actually listening to this very album, which is, well, regarding the music and the artwork, very fitting. So for me, many strange and interesting memories are attached to this album. So thank you, Cradle of Filth, for making this album. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you really enjoyed this video. If you want to see more, subscribe to my YouTube channel and also check out my other social media down below in the description. Also make sure to check out my website here, where you can find, for example, more information about my drumming equipment. See you next time.